Come there. So hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 172. And I do believe that this is the first episode of season 4. I'm kind of making this up because I know it's been a long time, but I think this is the first episode of season 4, Ian. So my guest today is Ian Williams, the author of the book Soil and Spirit, Seeds of Purpose, Nature's Insight, and the Deep Work of Transformational Change. I have just met Ian. I guess we could call it meeting, Ian. We had a Zoom call.
This is a virtual meeting, like so many these days.
Right. I mean, he's a real person. He lives not that far from me, and I live in Fargo. He lives in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So it feels like you're a real dude, Ian. Welcome to this conversation.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Jody.
Did you feel like when we met virtually last week that there was just something there, Ian? Like I felt like I knew you.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's part of the reason why I reached out to you to begin with, right? We had talked a little bit about the copy on the websites and some of the language that we use there. So I agree, some kinship.
It's funny that can happen without geographical boundaries and without having to be in person. Now, I don't know about you, but in person's always better for me. I love energy in person, but it felt like I really connected with you, Ian, even, virtually.
Yeah. I agree. Appreciate it.
So I want to know more about the book because the book looks awesome. I haven't seen it yet. It's new. But I'm going to read a little bit from the information about the book, Soil and Spirit, just so you get an idea of who Ian is. It says here, monumental challenges threaten the 6th mass extinction on planet Earth. From increasing rates of infertility and chronic disease to soil degradation and climate collapse, reviving civilization requires change makers to step forward and lead with their own unique genius. So at the beginning there's some doomsday, and I mean, we need to be real about stuff. That's what our podcast is about, being real. There are real threats to humanity, Ian, that you're concerned about. But what I know from having met you, there's hope, and there's deeper meaning to everything. So it's not that we have to just, throw everything out and say, life's over, we're going to hell in a handbasket. You say, and in this book, in Soil and Spirit, Ian Williams presents a simple solution. And I love these. Simple solution, self-actualization. That's it. Simple. So there's depth to this. Solutions at scale begin with individuals organizing themselves. Ian guides the reader through that process via 4 primary landscapes: internal, social, external, and spiritual. This book is not only a message, but a methodology for designing resilient landscapes, both inside and out. Brilliant, Ian, brilliant.
Well, I can't take copy for that credit.
Take credit for that copy.
Yeah, it's no doubt a big idea book. It is not a doomsday book, right? I mean, I set it up in the first, there's 4 sections, but each section is made up of short passages. I set up, the intro, the author's note is essentially that framing this, backdrop for the 6th mass extinction. And then we just move right beyond it. I think there's countless studies out there that demonstrate that shame and guilt are not effective motivators of change. And so that is not what the book is about. It's simply meant to, kind of rattle the cage for the reader at the beginning to say, hey, just a reminder, this is the stage which we are playing out this game of life on. And if we want to be effective agents of change and, create a healthier stage, so to speak, then we need to dive deep, do our own internal work in order to realize how we can contribute to this landscape, this greater landscape. So it's really a book that's meant to guide the reader, I don't want to say on a linear path, but of course, when you're writing something like this and you're pulling from many different places, you try and make it as linear as possible. But, those 4 landscapes, internal, social, external, and spiritual, it's meant to guide the reader from the inside out, right? That's kind of the process and the methodology behind it, from inside to out.
So you're speaking my language. Anybody who listens to this podcast, you should be really, it should be no surprise that we had a really great conversation when we first met. And my question, I'll get to the questions about the book, but my question is about you, Ian. I want to know more about you. So This book is great. I'm excited to read it. There's a lot of good things about it. I'll just give a bio, and then I'm going to ask you more about you. Ian Williams is an educator, speaker, and business advisor. Through mindfulness, systems thinking, and regenerative design, he empowers the growth and development of individuals and communities. This is great. Yes. And how did you get there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far you want me to go back, but
I want you to go wherever you want to go.
I grew up, I was not born, but I was raised in Twin Cities, Minnesota. So I consider it home. I had a very stable childhood. I had an intact family. I'm very fortunate to be able to say that. I had an older sister. We always had a four-legged, dog running around. I kind of jokingly say I had pretty much everything except the white picket fence. We were solidly middle-class family. I didn't really want for a lot as a child. And as adolescence rolled around, I think I took that stability and I wanted to start creating a little bit of my own chaos. And so at the age of 13, I started to use drugs and alcohol, and it was a quick road into addiction. It was probably a matter of 2 or 3 weeks from like the first time I tried it to the day that I was using it multiple times every single day.
Wow.
So I definitely think I've got addictive tendencies that run in the family, but that's how it manifested for me. And that lasted from 13 to 25.
Wow.
So that was 12 years of drugs and alcohol, and a lot of stuff transpired. But if anybody's listening who has a background with addiction and recovery, hopefully, they might resonate with the fact that like, it feels like a lot's happening emotionally, but not a lot's happening in terms of like where you're actually moving in life. So fast forward about 10 years, I'm in college. I sublet a room with some guys over the summer, and we inherited this beautiful pit bull. And the end of our lease came up in August, and we all decided we were going to part ways. And we had this question, who's going to take the dog? So I raised my hand. I think subconsciously at the time, there was this hope drive that, if I inherited this dog and I took responsibility for her, it might help me learn some responsibility myself. Fast forward a few more years. She was not the most stable of pups. She had trauma in her background. And I was obviously not in the healthiest place in my own life. We did everything we could as a family. I mean, we're a dog family, and we did everything we knew how to do at that time. Multiple trainers, multiple medications, multiple assessments, we just did the works, and it didn't really work out. And we had a final assessment at the University of Minnesota, and basically we're told without being told, you either live with this dog in your house or you don't take this dog out of the house, which is a pretty small world. Being young, being stubborn, I didn't really listen. So I moved out with a friend, and we were doing just fine. And there was just one day where another dog was passing through the hallway at the same time that we had a friend coming over. So we opened the door, and my dog got out, and it turned into a battle royale in the hallway. Probably 15, 20 minutes that it took us to break up this dog fight. Ultimately, it led to me making the decision, like, I got to let her go. So we got back in the room, and I remember her eyes just looked at me. I mean, she's got blood on her face. I've got blood on my hands. I'm traumatized. And her eyes just switched, and it was like, what's next? Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? Like, for her, the moment was over. And that was one of the first times that I witnessed in another being, like, what true presence is. Because for her, what had just happened was now done. And she was here. She was back in the apartment. She was fine, or at least that's how I perceived it. And I just had this kind of awareness shift in that moment. So I took a month to prepare for the decision, and we put her down on December 30th of 2013. About 5 days later, I'm laying awake in bed, and I'm staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night. And she came back to visit. She nudged the door open. She hopped up on the bed next to me. I could see her and I could hear her, but she didn't make an imprint on the mattress. And she rolled up and she let out that patented sigh that she always did when it was time to go to bed, and I fell asleep. And I woke up in the morning and I was journaling about it, and I thought it was a dream. But while I was writing, I realized, like, excuse my language, but holy shit, I was awake when that happened. And it just totally shattered my perception of what reality was. It completely blew the doors off the hinges. And that was really a major turning point, right? So like stable childhood, chaotic adolescence, early adulthood, and then this pivotal moment of, what am I going to do about this? And I knew enough at that time to know I had to do something. It was a little naive, but I thought, I need to go figure this whole spirituality thing out. But that led to what's been the last decade of my life, which is a deep dive into Eastern spiritual philosophy, systems thinking. So I started going to yoga, led to meditation, led to Qigong, led to martial arts, led to Tai Chi. I just went deep down the rabbit hole of these self-cultivation practices. Around the same time was having my own environmental awakening, to the state of affairs in terms of the climate. And that's all kind of culminated into where am I at now, right? And so I've gone through different iterations, which we can dive into deeper, but this notion that if we're going to address some of these grand challenges, really the only thing we can do is address it within ourselves. Because otherwise we have a lot of broken people out in the world trying to heal stuff. And if they don't understand what it means to be healed, we're just going to create more brokenness.
Boy,
so, yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of that and for being that open and vulnerable to go there. Through your journey, I'm guessing the authenticity that you share in your book and speaking and consulting, things like that you do, that's what drew me to you. That's what I recognized in you as well. I'm curious, when you were, let's say 18-ish, deciding to go to college, you went to college, right? What were you thinking you wanted to do in the middle of all of this chaos?
Yeah. At that time in my life, in undergrad, I double majored in psychology and community arts. I thought I wanted to be a therapist. I had loving and supportive parents. And so at the age of 13 or 14, when they sat me down for the first time and said, "Why are you using?" My answer at the time was, "I don't know." And my father was very perceptive in that moment and said, "I remember that feeling, right? I struggled with my own depression and anxiety, and I didn't know why. So let's start him in therapy, talk therapy." And the first therapist I ever went to changed my life, and started to teach me the power of vulnerability. And so at that time, and my mantra for those 5 to 8 years maybe was, if I could make one person a day feel the way that I feel when I leave this guy's office, my job would be worth it. So my father is a college professor, chair of an art department. My mom was a kindergarten teacher. So I always joke I had both ends of the education continuum covered. College wasn't really an option, we were just going.
Yep.
And I thought I wanted to be a therapist until I realized I can't even handle my own problems. How am I going to handle somebody else's problems?
So what was your major? What did you do, or what did you graduate with?
I stuck with psychology and community arts.
Okay.
It was probably my junior year in undergrad where I realized this isn't a long-term path for me. It was also the awareness of, if I want to actually be a therapist, I need to continue on to get a master's, if not a PhD. And at that point in my life, I was just not interested or willing and wanting to continue on with my education in that capacity. But I was very fortunate my senior year to have an internship at a local organization at the time. Now they're national, called the Jeremiah Program. So this is an organization that provides comprehensive support services to mothers with young children. I think they have one in Fargo, actually.
They do.
Make a long story short, I ended up doing childcare on Tuesday and Thursday nights as part of my internship, while the mothers were taking life skill classes. And I just absolutely loved it. And I grew up saying, I'm never going to be an educator. Both my parents are teachers, right? Apple tree. And at that point, I was a semester away from graduating. So I said, I'm just going to finish my program. I've put so much time and energy into orchestrating this double major already. I'm just going to finish it and go figure it out after school. So I did. And then the first 5 years of my career, I was an early childhood educator.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's awesome. No, I'm just picturing, because I'm not familiar personally with addiction and the chaos that you've kind of pictured for me here. How is the navigation of that when I'm just making an assumption that there are some sort of demons in you that are pulling you to make decisions that aren't necessarily the most healthy ones, yet you're still able to get your degree, be an educator. Can you explain that?
I should say one lives a fairly compartmentalized life.
Mm.
I was fortunate. I mean, I'm still a bit hesitant to use the terms addiction and recovery. I mean, I was certainly an addict. I wanted to stop and I couldn't, if that's your definition of addiction. But I don't really have like this rock bottom moment kind of a story, like a lot of people do in the community, right? And so I was relatively high functioning. I was able to double major in 4 years. Was on the golf team for a couple of years in college. Was able to hold a steady job, but it was compartmentalized. And so I would go to work and I was Mr. Ian in the classroom for those first few years. And then I would leave work and it was like, the wheels would kind of come off. I would just go home and the first thing I would do is get high. And then it was like, wherever my night took me is where I would go. And then you just wake up, wash, rinse, repeat. And it was during those 5 years where I think it was at that time where I said, I really need to start taking this seriously. So it was the 1 year anniversary of my dog's passing. And I had moved out, was living with another guy. And I had a week off at the end of the calendar year, needed to use up some PTO. And the first night that I was home, I was just standing with him in the kitchen talking. I shifted my weight to my left leg and my knee like buckled. I felt this shooting pain. I was like, well, that kind of hurt, but I'm 24 at the time or something. I was like, I'll just wake up and be fine. I woke up the next morning, I couldn't walk. So I had this week off where I was literally laid up in bed. And it was a year after my dog's passing, like to the day when I was laid up in bed. And so it just gave me a ton of time to think and reflect. I couldn't move. I was home alone all day. And it was in that week where I kind of got the message from the universe, like, you need to figure out this sobriety thing. You need to figure out your addiction thing. Otherwise, your life's not going to go anywhere. And there was a series of events that had led up to that moment where I just kind of got closer and closer to death. I don't know how else to say it, like literally. So that was kind of the beginning of the end. I woke up on, I think it was the last day of the year, and like opened up my little jar and, had one tiny little nugget of weed left. And I was like, all right, I get the point. So it's kind of a very cliche. I'm going to wake up on January 1 and, try and get sober, which I had done 1,000 times before in my life. But to your question about, what's underlying, I think that's really that's the crux of it all, right? I know a lot of people now who are sober, but through my assessment, they haven't really done the deep dive into why did I start using in the first place? So that's one thing that I often say, right? It's one thing to get clean. It's another thing to address the underlying emotional content that caused your use in the first place. And I'm just a rip the Band-Aid off kind of guy. I dive in the deep end. And so I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that. I just had to figure it out. So that started this long journey of emotional vulnerability, which is a lot of what is imbued in the book, right? This single and simple solution of self-actualization. I use the word simple very calculatedly. It's not easy work, but it is simple. Turning inward is simple process, can be a simple process. And so I had my little practices and I would wash, rinse, repeat, exercise and journal. And as I mentioned, the energy arts. And I would just start to learn about myself and started to develop the tools to experience my emotions, which I'm still continuing to do. It happens in stages, but yeah, it's a compartmentalized life. And, you can either choose to turn towards the ugly and the dark, or you can choose to avoid it. But the reality is, my reality has been the only way out, the only way to truly escape it is to move through it, right? Because the more you avoid it, you're just kind of stuffing it down, putting a lid on it.
Yeah, this is so, so crucial for so many reasons. For those of, I bet there are people everywhere who have some sort of addiction somewhere. I'll probably bet almost everybody, if they really think about it, so many addictive personality traits. I have no friends who are addicted to working out, who are addicted to sugar, things that don't seem as radical as addicted to drugs and alcohol and whatever else can really kill you, literally. But it's a personality thing. Like you said, it's, I can't not do this. I need to keep doing this. And I love that you said the only way to address it is to go through it. You can't, I suppose we could avoid our lives forever and then just wake up one day and that's our last day and say, well, that was a nice ride. But like you, I'm not interested in only living a portion of my life. I'm interested in living to the edges, which is what we talk about here on this podcast. So thank you for sharing that whole journey. So the dog died a year later, your knee went out, left knee, by the way. I'm guessing there's some significance to that.
Probably.
I've understood that left side is spiritual, right side is physical. So if it was your left knee, maybe that was telling you something. Laying in bed, waking up, taking charge. What was the next step then after? Did your knee recover? Did you need surgery? What happened?
I didn't need surgery. At the time, and she's now my wife, but at the time I had just started dating a woman who was a yoga therapist. And so she was a monumental help in terms of helping me get back on track, literally. Help my knee get back on track. I think it was probably, I mean, this is totally self-diagnosis and a little bit of body awareness. I think it was probably a torn meniscus, partially torn meniscus. One of the things that I did that year immediately following letting go of my dog was, okay, she occupied so much space in my life. I need to fill that space with something healthy or some things that are healthy. Because if I don't, I know exactly what I'm going to fill it with, and it's more drugs and alcohol. So I, like I said, it was kind of cliche. It was like 2 years back to back of fairly cliche January 1. I signed up for a marathon. I started going to yoga class, and that kind of led. So I had run a marathon that year before. And I think just all the miles pounding the pavement took its toll on my knees. And I love training for the half marathon distance. I hated training for the full marathon distance. So I wasn't really taking super great care of my body. And I mean, at that time I was still eating bar food and drinking and, like just totally abusing my body because I could. I didn't need surgery, but I woke up, and like I said, I'm going to get sober. And that was kind of just a cold turkey process. I never went to NA or, AA, anything like that. I went to one meeting one time, and it just felt very uncomfortable and not aligned. So I just kind of did it on my own, and to go back to some of your early comments about like addictive behavior, if there's someone out there, you said maybe we're all addicts or have some of those tendencies. If there's anyone listening who doesn't feel like they're an addict, the word that I would replace it with is compulsion. Right? So when I woke up 2014 and said, I'm going to be done, I gave myself permission to do exactly what I did when I quit smoking cigarettes years ago. Right? I said, I'm going to smoke as much weed as I want to stop smoking cigarettes. I woke up on January 1, 2014 and said, I'm going to eat as much chocolate and drink as much kombucha as I want to, so long as it keeps me from using. I spent more money on kombucha and chocolate than I ever did on drugs and alcohol for those next 3 months. And that's a true statement. But it was the beginning of really starting to acknowledge and reckon the compulsive tendencies in my life. Right. And now I would describe that as simply I was unconscious about what was happening. I was unconscious about my decision making and my behaviors. I was totally unconscious of what was happening emotionally, and so that manifests as compulsion. We become neurotic because it's like, well, maybe this will fix it today. Maybe this will fix it right now. Maybe this will fix it tomorrow. And we're just shooting from the hip with a blindfold on in the dark. We have no idea what's actually happening. And what's actually going to address it. And even if we do, chances are likely that in the West, we're approaching it primarily through an intellectual mindset. And there's so many different layers to the body, right? You have your physical and your somatic, your emotional layer, there's spiritual, and there's energy in there, right? So you can't use the mind to decipher all of those things because it's not the nature of the mind itself. So if there's anyone struggling with the language, replace addiction with compulsion or neurotic, and then do some reflecting and see if that resonates. But, all of this stuff kind of leads to, I'm starting to dive into this work. And then you start to realize some truths about your life. If I want to change, if I want my life to become what I actually know that it can become, if I want to self-actualize, I've got to do X, Y, Z. I've got to knock over this domino run, and so my social life turned over, my diet and nutritional life turned over, my physical fitness turned over, relationships with family members turned over, like everything turned upside down on its head. And the only tool that I had at that point in my life was, I'm just going to lean fully into this emotional vulnerability piece. I'm going to take complete responsibility for feeling, because I've spent the last 12 years not feeling.
Right.
And that's what guided me through those first, probably 3 years of my sobriety journey.
Was there anybody you followed, any books that you read, or anything that helped you on that journey, or was it just a solo trek?
I mean, we're social creatures, and so I can't say, no, I did it entirely on my own. None of us do. That being said, I'm a deeply introspective and introverted person. And a lot of it was just out of my own volition. But then I would use things like books that I read, or therapy sessions that I had, or, meditation classes or trainings that I went to, as these catalysts for self-reflection. Right. And so basically the process for me, and continues to be, is taking the kind of stimuli of the outside world. We all have it, right? That thing, that one sentence that one person said to you who you didn't know very well 10 years ago, that's still somehow impacting and shaping your life. Those types of experiences. And I would just chew on them, and I would reflect on them. And writing and journaling, specifically free writing, sometimes creative writing, for me was a tool that I was using to process emotions. There were days where, and still are days, where I sit down and I'll just write for 3 hours at a time. At the time, it was just something I needed to like slow the mind down, because the mind was just a pinball machine. And it forces you to think at the pace of your writing.
Yeah.
But, there were many other things, but I can't necessarily look back and say there was, one teacher that I followed, or there was one. It was an amalgamation of things, right? I'm taking multiple trainings, I'm consuming a lot of information. And now, about 10 years later, I'm coming up on 8 years sober. There's no, it's kind of this awareness that we're using more information to try and get to less, and that's part of our culture here in the West. We're consuming more information about optimization or making money or whatever it is that you're consuming information about, but you're really trying to get to less. And what I mean by that is, we've convoluted our experience of life by thinking that we can structure it in a certain way, and then it'll all just be gravy. Like we'll just wake up one day and life will be perfect and it'll stay steady state. That's not the nature of life itself. It's not the nature of the mind. That's not the nature of the body. Not the nature of emotion. And so over the years, I've just kind of learned the answer is not going to be in the next teacher or guru or practice or workout session or book that I read or podcast that I listen to, or. It's not going to be at the bottom of the next bottle that I drink, right? It's somewhere inside. And I need to turn inward to find that space.
This is so good. What then would you, or is it possible for you to characterize or name that entity or that spiritual source for you? Is it necessary to do that? I don't know, maybe not.
Well, so I mentioned I went into Eastern spiritual philosophy.
Yeah.
Largely Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism. And once I found Taoism and Qigong as a practice, I really kind of felt like I landed home. But there's a phrase in the Tao Te Ching, which is kind of, you might call it like the Bible of Taoism, written by Lao Tzu. And it's something to the effect of, the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. And so this is where I feel like we're at an important turning point in our conversation, because similar to my comments around trying to process all of life through the intellect, the spiritual process is not one that's intellectual, it's experiential, right? The process of self-actualization is not only intellectual, it's experiential. And so I could start, waxing poetically about what that is for me, what the source is, but ultimately it's an experiential awareness and continual understanding of the body, because the body is the tuning fork that receives and interprets messages from the world, right? From the surroundings. And for those of us that are, again, like most of us in the West, are overly identified with the mind, we think we're understanding the world intellectually. But if you really break it down on a scientific level, we're just making stuff up through mental synapses, right? And these chemical reactions that are happening in our brain, which are being received from other places in the body, right? Or coming through the eyes and the five senses. So we're not really thinking our way through the world. We're experiencing our way through the world. And it's a very subtle shift in perception and understanding. But as I have, really focused on becoming more aware of those things, your understanding of life and your experience of life can really expand. So, I don't necessarily feel like I am, it's not like I believe in any one religion or any one God or a monotheistic or polytheistic. Like, I pick and choose from all these things and I figure out what resonates with me. And then I chew on it internally, right? To try and make something out of it experientially, or to simply sit and allow the experience to happen and see what I can observe from it. And that's what teaches me, right? So this notion that we become our own teacher. Even if you're in the classroom or you're studying with the guru, the teachings that they're giving you, you're still internalizing, right? They're not doing the work for you, you're doing the work for yourself.
Yeah.
And so this is also, I don't bring any, I shouldn't say not any, but I don't bring this spirituality language into my work with organizations. But it's a similar process, right? If we're working on culture, for example, what's going to change the culture is not a new set of mission, vision, value statements. What's going to change the culture is individuals from top down and bottom up within the organization changing themselves, showing up in a different way. And that doesn't happen when you do the surface level stuff. That happens when you really dive deep to the core.
So, okay, I love that you shifted to this. Western, we are Western. I have been programmed and conditioned the same way you're describing. There's a lot of mind chatter and then mind quieting as a process, as a doing. We're on the treadmill of life in organizations, as you've described, not top down, not bottom up, but individuals in an organization. I completely agree with you that the way to have an organization shift culture is for individuals to begin. Yet, in the busyness of the Western world we both live in, I have experienced that being a really, really overwhelming process to have people invest resources and capital with an ROI attached to it. Tell me about that process for you as an advisor and a consultant to organizations.
This is why we typically start with business process optimization, because you're absolutely right. They're interconnected. Similar, so if we were to take a climate justice stance, right? How can you ask someone to care about having a positive impact on the climate when they're struggling to put food on the table or keep the lights on? That's not a reasonable thing to ask of that person, right? Similarly, in an organization, how can you expect individuals or the organization itself to really dive deep on culture when they're just putting out fires every day because of their business processes? So this has largely been informed by my own experience as an employee, right? Working in organizations that are just hyper dysfunctional and toxic, and having an awareness that, like, there's a line in the sand here. There's business process stuff that's happening that could easily be addressed, but we're not able to address it, or we're choosing not to address it. And then there's this like toxicity socially within the organization, and they're totally enmeshed. But if we can put that line in the sand and separate them, now we're compartmentalizing in such a way that allows us to be a little bit more effective in our work. Mm. So similar to the book and this, in to out process, we take a similar approach with the organizations that we work with. First, we're focusing on business processes, things that are internal to the organization that are 100% within the control of the organization itself. And then we move to the emotional well-being or engagement or the culture space of the organization. Again, still predominantly within the organization, but now we're talking about people and emotions and social patterns, so it's a little bit more squishy. But once we do the first thing, focus on business processes and get that really dialed in, theoretically, we've got more bandwidth to devote mentally and emotionally, energetically, to the culture of the organization. We can have that conversation in a more sustainable manner. And then the third bucket for us is social and environmental impact. Once we clean up what's going on in the organization, now we can really move beyond and ask the question, what greater impact does this organization want to have beyond the service it provides, the widgets it creates, et cetera? So we take a very, and we don't always move in this 1, 2, 3 manner, but it's kind of our holistic service model. And we always try and explain it and communicate it whenever we're working with clients and people is we want to focus on the tangible first. And we're going to work on skills and development here that you're going to be able to then apply. It's the same context, but it's different content, right? So we focus on business process. Typically, we focus on that first. That creates a little bit of buy-in. People start to say, oh, I don't have to work 60 hours a week. Maybe I can work 45. Mm-hmm. Now I've got more energy, right? Or I don't have to work 50 hours a week. Maybe I can work 30. We've taken some organizations we've reduced their working hours by 40%, going from 70-hour work weeks down to 35, 40. Imagine what that does for your well-being, right? Now we can have a more sustainable conversation about employee engagement, well-being, culture.
So when you initiate those conversations at the very beginning, it's a pain point conversation, I would bet, because, you need to, self-actualization doesn't happen at the top first. It happens at the bottom first. And as you said earlier about if they have trouble putting food on the table, they're not thinking about anything but that. And so I'm betting in your processes, it starts there. That's a given. In your experience, how long has it taken to move from 1, 2, 3, if you kind of think about it linearly? Is there a typical time?
Yeah, it depends on the size of the organization. Okay. It depends on how quickly that organization is, how motivated they are to move through the process. Smaller teams, we can move through the first phase in anywhere from 3 to 9 months, because there's just less moving parts. Mm-hmm. Once we get to larger departments or larger organizations, once you're in a larger organization, you're typically focusing departmentally, right? We usually say 6 to 12 months for phase 1, about 12 months for phase 2, and 12 to 18 months for phase 3. But it depends on if an organization wants to essentially let us come in and just deliver our off-the-shelf services, or if they really want a tailored white glove custom approach, which is really the work that we prefer to do. We're not your standard consulting firm that's going to say, we're going to do a discovery process and then basically sell you the thing that we already know we want to sell you. Right. We're going to do the discovery process to learn those key insights to then design a custom solution for you, because every organization is different. Yeah. And so that's the work we really prefer to do, but we understand not everybody's willing to devote that time and energy and cost to it. So, we've also over the years learned these are kind of the core suite. These are the essential skills that everybody can benefit from. And that became our off-the-shelf services. So it depends on time, depends on size, depends on motivation. It also depends on the culture of the organization when we show up, right? If it's super toxic, it might take quite a bit longer to move through the process. If people are on board and it's a healthy, by and large, relatively healthy culture, well, then, the wheels are already greased and we can just dive in and start running. So it's a difficult question to answer, but, we're usually in that 3 to 12 month range per phase.
Got it. So I'm thinking about your journey, and it was a long journey for you to get to the point where, you had that episode with your dog. And then, there are other things that had you continue to wake up, it seems, dig deeper by removing layers and becoming more vulnerable. So in an organizational context, if a CEO or a founder of an organization is like, I've tried everything and nothing's working, it seems like a kind of a similar process where they have to, maybe, you said you didn't hit rock bottom, but maybe they have to get to that point where they're seeing rock bottom before they're willing to get vulnerable as a founder of an organization, where we don't typically do that because we don't talk about feelings at work. That's ridiculous. Tell me about that process for maybe a success story.
Yeah. Before I dive in, we tried to encapsulate this in our business name and slogan, right? So the name of the company is StillPoint Insight.
I didn't
It's
even
not-
ask it. StillPoint Insight.
It's not your, typical ABC consulting firm. The reason that that's our name is because when we reach that still point of accepting reality for what it is, therein lies the insight. It's in that space that we can learn about ourselves, about the process, about the company, about self-actualization, about others, wherever, right?
Mm.
So the name of the company tries to encapsulate this. We're trying to drive people to a space of stillness so that they can take the blindfold off, turn the lights on, and stop shooting from the hip. And say, let's take a systematic approach to solving these problems. And that's really what we do. It's a systematic approach to creating context-specific solutions. We don't know when we show up what the issues are, but we take a systematic approach to learning, discovering those key insights, and then designing custom solutions. So anyway, the business name and then also the slogan: culture by design, strategy by choice, impact by default. So if we're intentional about the culture that we're designing, and we take this strategic approach, the impact is going to happen by default. Again, it's not that, we certainly do, mission, vision, values work with companies, but it's not that that's going to solve all of the problems. We really need to dive deep into understanding. And this is, if I could wave a magic wand for leadership, and we're fortunate enough to work with mission-driven companies. We're passionate about trying to help people who are solving big problems at scale. That's really who we love to work with. It's not the only people we work with, but it's who we love to work with. So we're fortunate that we already have leaders who are kind of aware of this stuff, right? And they're mission-driven, and they understand their people are important, and that's what creates profitability, et cetera. If I could wave a magic wand and say, I wish every leader could understand this, it would just be doing away with this old Western colonial definition of leadership, which is command and control. I'm at the top. Everybody else in the organization answers to me. They're all subordinates, etc. Unfortunately, this still exists, and people are suffering under those leaders every single day. And those leaders are creating their own suffering every single day. It's not that anyone is at fault. It is simply, this is what we've been conditioned to learn. This is what we've been taught. This is what we have absorbed in the West from the culture that we've grown up in, right? But it's an outdated method of leadership. And that's part, as we were talking in our first conversation when we were doing our meet and greet, that's one of the things that I'm so excited about over these last couple of years. COVID has been extremely challenging for all of us. And certainly there's been, a portion of us that are far more privileged than others in terms of how it impacted us and our families and our communities. That always exists on a spectrum, but it has kind of catapulted this conversation of equity into the forefront. And it's forced people like me, who from the outside would be perceived as white, cisgendered, heterosexual male, to really ask challenging questions of myself and how I show up in the space, right? Oh, people hold the door for me and I walk in first. And all of the other litany of privileges that come with looking like I do and presenting like I do in this society. So then now I have to ask the question, my life's about service. How do I leverage this privilege to be of service? And that's, if I could wave that magic wand, Leaders don't lead from the top. They actually lead from the bottom, right? And that's another passage from the Tao. It's something to the effect of like, we don't lead from the front, we lead from behind. Everybody has to get to this place in their own time. And we have been taught in the West that we will get there through striving and achieving and hard work. But the reality is, it's not until we slow down and shut the F up and allow things to surface and then pay attention so that we can process through them. It's not until we move through that process that we really start to discover key insights that become the levers of change to have the impact that we really want to have. Because this whole consumption model of capitalism and the West has gotten us into this ecological crisis to begin with.
Well, and that was what I was going to say about the whole Earth's resources and being finite, and capitalism based on competition, and all of the things that we only know because we probably don't even really know it in our minds. We could just, because it's not been anything that we've allowed to surface. We don't even question it. It's just the way it's always been. And I love your philosophy and everything about the possibilities that exist in the conversations to start with, so that you can help paint a picture of something that could be different, not better necessarily, but the only way to better is through different. So unless people are willing to say something needs to shift, they're probably not a client for you.
Yep.
I would talk to you forever, Ian. There's so much we could say. I'm running up against a time crunch here in my Western world of scheduling. I would love to do this again. Please tell me how people can find you. What's the best way for people to find out about your book, about your company? Is it a website that they can go to?
Yeah. If you want to contact me directly, there's various ways to do it. If you're interested in the book, www.reviveyouandi.com. It's the word revive, the letter U, ANDI.com. You can email me directly, ian@reviveyouandi.com. That's probably the best website to just get into my ecosystem. If there's business leaders out there that are listening that want to have a chat and a discovery call, you can either contact me through that website, or you can go to stillpointinsight.com. I very intentionally drew a line in the sand because that business is larger than just me. And so I don't want to be the face of it in that sense. And so you can learn a lot more about our philosophy and our approach at stillpointinsight.com. If anybody is out there that's more active and engaged in social media than I, Revive You and I is my handle on all the social media channels as well. So you can find me on Instagram and YouTube and all those places. And that's actually, for me, the next phase of vulnerability is moving beyond podcasts like this and speaking opportunities and into content creation. So I promise everybody out there that I'm working to get more active on social media. So if you go there and you sign up, you'll learn more about me in the coming months and weeks. But yeah, reviveyouandi.com is a great place to start. You can find the book pretty much any online major retailer. If you want a free sample, if you're not totally convinced, you can go to the website, subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll get a free digital sample. Yeah, would love to talk too. Like, just reach out. If anybody's feeling inspired, I love, getting the notes. I love having one-to-one conversations. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah. This is what it takes, everyone who's listening. This is, the tagline of our podcast, everybody who listens, is having conversations that matter with people who matter. And the secret is that's everyone. So as long as we're willing to have a kind of conversation that will take us beyond the surface, it's amazing and just enlivening to see what comes out. And even Ian, this has been a great example of that. So thank you for being with me today. And I look forward to a second conversation, at least a second.
Appreciate the opportunity, Jody. I'm glad we could take the time to do it, make the time to do it. And I agree that the secret is in plain sight. It's going to take all of us. And, the book is just my offering of service to the world, in the sense of trying to help other people figure out what's my role in this. So
good. So everybody, there's a lot to think on, a lot to ponder, to meditate, to allow. And if you're inspired, please reach out to Ian. And as always, get real. Talk to you again, everybody. Bye.